Really quickly, I'll give you some backstory. The punishment of the dogs was an annual sacrifice of ancient Rome in which a live dog is suspended from a fork or a cross and it was paraded through the town. In the same procession, the geese were also decorated in gold and purple and carried in honor. These geese were honored for saving the city during the Gallic siege of Rome. The geese raised a noisy alarm while the watchdogs failed to bark. Thus, this punishment began, and again, it began sometime around 390 to 387 BC, before Christ. This was the phrase that Father brought to my mind, starting in verse 16 of Psalms 22. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and feet. Verse 20, deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. Now going over to Matthew 27, starting in verse 12, and when he was accused of the chief priests and elders, he, being Jesus, answered nothing. Then said Pilate unto him, hearest thou not how many things they witnessed against thee? And he answered him, and never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. So here we see in this verse, Jesus never spoke a word while on trial. And you can see that through Mark and Luke's gospel as well, and I believe it's also mentioned in John. But this is what Mark chapter 15, verses 10 through 14 have to say. Actually, we're going to start in verse 9 of Mark 15. But Pilate answered them, saying, will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy, for jealousy. But the chief priest moved the people that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. And Pilate answered and said again unto them, what will ye then that I shall do unto him, whom you call the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, crucify him. Then Pilate said unto them, why, what evil hath he done? And they cried out the more exceedingly, crucify him. And if you read about halfway through this is part of what I was just sharing with you. You can pause to read this for yourself. This speaks of the punishment of the dogs. The temple geese are said to have raised the alarm instead, rationalized the dogs' failure by explaining that the Gauls fed the siege-starved dogs and silenced them, while the geese called out excitingly in recognition of their service. For this procession, the geese were decked out in purple and gold, and they were carried on a litter. So here we see that the geese are being well taken care of through this annual sacrifice every year for the Roman emperor or the empire that they would partake in. But the dogs, however, were brutally sacrificed. The dogs were living while they were being crucified. This was known as the punishment of the dogs. Jesus never spoke a word while on trial. But if you notice, the chief priests, they moved the people. And they all hollered, crucify him, crucify him. The dogs were then placed on a stake, or what is now known as a cross, and was used as a traditional instrument of punishment to which the condemned was bound. This was done because the dog was considered to be an enemy of the state. Of course, because of that, the dog had to be scourged also. This is the Greek word for stake, implements of a capital punishment. And this is what they carried the dogs on as they paraded them through town. Of course, it needed to be a little bit bigger for specific reasons. And because the dogs have been considered enemies of the state, a form of capital punishment was scourging. The hands were tied and the head was veiled. The stake was originally a dead or barren tree, possibly a fruit tree or unproductive tree or a tree of ill fortune. One of these several species regarded as under guardianship of however you pronounce this which, by the way, is this. Looks familiar. And then you can pause to read this, but I'll read some of it. Although the dogs are not said to have been beaten, the punishment of the dogs share some implements or elements with the traditional punishments at the stake. And then you can read the rest of it for yourself. I think it's worth your time. And as I stated earlier, they paraded the dogs around town. Luke 23, starting in verse 26. And as they led him away, they laid hold upon one Simon, a Cyrenian, coming out of this country, and on him they laid the cross, that he might bear it after Jesus. And there followed him a great company of people and of women, which also bewailed and lamented him. They would also, in their custom, blindfold the dog before they beat him, or sometimes while they beat him. Luke 22, 63 through 65. And when the men that held Jesus mocked him and smote him, and when they had blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, Prophesy, who is it that smote thee? And many other things blasphemous spake they against him. There's a lot more, but I'm going to cut this one short. This was known again as the punishment of the dogs, and this is what I'm going to title the folder as. So if you see this video in passing and you stop and check it out, there's more, so look for the folder. The high priest, the chief priest, the scribes and the Pharisees were the geese in this story. Jesus is not a dog. But here is Jesus paraded through town. He's blindfolded. He's about to be ready to be scourged because he is the enemy of the state. But he never spoke a word. Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling, from the power of the dog.